Introduce our next speaker, Chandra Legui. She's going to talk about the importance of protecting public lands in an era of climate change. Chandra is Oregon Wild's Western Oregon Field Coordinator based in Eugene. She works to fulfill Oregon Wild's mission of protecting and restoring Oregon's wildlands, wildlife, and waters, and is the author of a forthcoming book about hiking in our state's ancient forests. Awesome. Chandra.
We at Oregon Wild have boiled that down into two main solutions. One is to better protect our public forest lands, and one is to reform logging laws on the other half of Oregon's forests, and Jason's going to talk about. Okay, so real quick, for those of you who don't know about Oregon Wild, Frankie basically mentioned our mission, which is to protect and restore Oregon's wildlands, wildlife, and waters. And all of those things are going to be impacted by climate change. So it's one of the reasons we're paying so much attention to this. Throughout much of Oregon Wild's 45-year history, we have been working on protecting public lands, and only recently have added in, again, the other half of Oregon to really address some of the concerns that we have about wildlife habitat and water quality and this issue of climate change. So here's a probably a little bit fuzzy map of Oregon public lands, but as you can see, the orange and yellow and green and purple colors on the map, all the bright colors on the map, are our public lands. So it's over half of Oregon, and half of that is forested. And so, as Dominic drew attention to, this region is very important for this issue of climate change, because our forests here in Oregon are especially ripe for storing carbon because we just have this amazing growing climate. Most of that is going to be focused on the west half of the state, where we have better growing conditions, these dense Douglas fir and hemlock and spruce forests for storing carbon anyway. Though, if you're like me, you also love those beautiful ponderosa pine forests out in eastern Oregon. So our forests, I'm going to kind of zoom in, like I said, to the Coast Range as much as I can. Our forests here on public lands are mostly in the Siuslaw National Forest here in the Coast Range. And these are our favorite places, right? I mean, maybe your own backyard is pretty good. But all the places I go to recreate, to geek out on nature, which is pretty much my favorite thing to do, are found in the Siuslaw National Forest here in the Coast Range. So they're places we love to hike. They're places where endangered wildlife live. That's a northern spotted owl up there, and a cute little fuzzy red tree vole that they feed on. Probably not so cute then. These public lands are where we have soil resources preserved, with those healthy, deep, organic soils that filter water, and these giant trees that grow to keep our water cold and clear, and good habitat for salmon. So public lands are really the lands that are doing all of that around us, in part because of the industrial timberlands that really aren't doing that, and Jason will talk more about that. So we are already seeing impacts from climate change here in Oregon. These are the really obvious ones, like glacier shrinkage. That's Mount Hood in 1901, and there's the same view from just a couple of years ago, the Elliott Glacier. So, Dominic mentioned some of the things that we're going to see here in Oregon, and I think we know what those are, we know what's coming. I'm not focusing on sea level rise, but certainly here right on the coast, that's going to be an issue. But impacts to water are going to be huge. And I live in Eugene. I get my drinking water from the McKenzie River, which is a pretty major system, and it starts high up in the protected wilderness, and is filtered by lava rocks and it's melting snow and glaciers. You guys aren't so lucky out here. You still have great water in many places, but you're going to see bigger impacts on the coast because your rivers aren't filtered through, your water sources aren't filtered through those high elevation geology. So when we have more storm events and with bigger rainfall, that's going to lead to more floods and landslides and muddy rivers and all that kind of good stuff. Warmer temperatures outside means warmer water temperatures, and there's a lot more highs and lows in the summer and the winter that we're all going to have to deal with. Our plants and animals that live around here are going to have to deal with climate change as well, and are already seeing some of the impacts. There's hotter, drier conditions. The weather patterns and seasonal patterns are kind of out of whack. We've seen that bees and other pollinators emerge from hibernation, or not being able to find, or other animals not being able to find their food because they're either already spent or they haven't come out yet. There's things that are just a little out of whack. And then also with higher temperatures and these other impacts of climate change, we're going to see more disease and pathogens. One of the reasons that beetle-killed forests are becoming a problem across the West is because the winters just aren't getting cold enough to kill the beetles, the larvae, in the wintertime, and so they can just keep reproducing all year round and causing a problem. Of course, there's impacts from wildfire due to climate change, and this has become very obvious in the last couple of summers. Luckily, you guys don't live on the South Coast, where they were just swamped with smoke for the last 2 summers. And a lot of that, and Dominic mentioned this, is due to the hotter, drier weather. There's a longer fire season, and forest management plays into that as well. All right, so I'm going to get to solutions now. So in our booklet that we produce, we focus again on 2 major solutions. The first one is protect more public land, and there's a number of ways that we can do this. I'm going to go through pretty much all of these, and so I'll get right to that. The first one is to protect more forested wilderness, and I'm talking about wilderness with a capital W. It's one of the best ways really to protect our public lands. We can protect forests in this way through congressional action. Really only Congress can protect wilderness through the Wilderness Act. And wilderness protections mean that logging and additional fragmentation, like road building, is off limits forever in that landscape. So Oregon Wild has worked over the years to secure protections for some pretty vast landscapes, but only 4% of our state is protected in this way. That's only 2.5 million acres out of, well, I'm really bad at math, so. But we protected 2.5 million acres in this way. The good news is that 80% of that wilderness is forested. So that means it's storing carbon, it's growing naturally, it's not being logged, we're not removing carbon in an unnatural way. Sure, they might burn, but that there's way worse ways that a forest could go. The bad news also is that we have, or maybe this is good news, there are actually 4 million acres of potential forested wilderness still out there. And that means that there are still a lot of intact forested areas that could still be protected as wilderness or in other ways because they are still natural, functioning forest ecosystems. So this map shows in the darkest green, that's kind of what to pay attention to, the intact forests that have never been logged, and they're in over 1,000 acres or so in size. So that's where we're going to have those functioning watersheds and the oldest trees where there hasn't been logging and road building. So, as you can see, a lot of them are centered on the west side of the Cascades, and there's not a whole lot in our neck of the woods over here. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So there's a couple of great opportunities for protecting more forested wilderness, including right now. In fact, just this week, as Congress is finishing up their session, there's a chance that the Oregon Wildlands Act could pass. And that includes the Devil's Staircase Wilderness, which is down in the Coast Range outside of Reedsport in the Siuslaw National Forest, which our senators and Congressman DeFazio have been very supportive of over the years. But also a lot of other places. There's wild and scenic river protection for over 200 miles of rivers all across the state. There's protections for the additions to the wild road wilderness, and recreation areas designated for the Molalla River corridor. So it's a great bill. And Devil's Staircase is a place near and dear to my heart. It's about 26,000 acres and sits just inland from Reedsport. Another really important reason to protect this particular place is that it is so carbon rich. So this map, if you can make it out, bordered in purple is the Devil's Staircase Wilderness area. And the colors basically indicate the density of carbon storage. So the darker the green, the more carbon there is. Well, you can see that there's an awful lot of dark green within that proposed wilderness. And outside of that is industrial timberland, which isn't storing much carbon at all. So this is an oasis in a sea of clear cuts and past management, and certainly deserves protection for many reasons. It's a beautiful place, but especially for carbon reserves. So this is just a picture of some beautiful Coast Range wilderness. This is the Cummins Creek Wilderness just south of here. And you can see, these huge trees and all of that life is what's soaking that carbon dioxide up out of the atmosphere. This one's from the proposed Devil's Staircase Wilderness. Unfortunately, there's not a lot out there left on the Siuslaw National Forest as far as what we could protect as wilderness or in other ways. So if you're familiar with where the National Forest is, it kind of stretches from just south of Tillamook down to Lincoln City. There's some pieces, and then the big chunk from just south of here all the way down to Florence and almost to Reedsport. So it's 630,000 acres. It's a very large national forest, and as we've seen, there's tremendous potential to store carbon. But these maps over here show the large intact forest roadless areas, so areas that are mature forests that have never been logged and are larger than 1,000 acres or so and serving that role. There's not a whole lot out there. In fact, there's only, currently we only have protected a little over 22,000 acres. That's only 3.5% of the Siuslaw National Forest is protected as wilderness. In Drift Creek, Cummins Creek, and Rock Creek. If we added Devil's Staircase, which is down here at the bottom, it would more than double that because it's over 26,000 acres, and that would be really exciting. So in addition to Devil's Staircase, there's still about 100,000 acres in the Siuslaw National Forest in those orange areas that could potentially be protected and are still serving this important role of carbon sequestration and have never been logged. So in addition to protecting wilderness, another important way we can accomplish this goal of protecting our public lands for our climate is to make sure that we maintain the protections we already have for these forests. Dominic mentioned the Northwest Forest Plan and how the protections that it offered for the Siuslaw in particular. Most of the Siuslaw National Forest is designated as a reserve for habitat primarily, but that doesn't mean it can't store carbon at the same time. And so if we maintain those types of protections that help turn this area's forest from a source of carbon emissions into a storage capacity, that's really important. So that's some of the work that Oregon Wild does, is to maintain those protections. In addition to things like the roadless rule, which is a national rule that protects those large roadless areas. The Endangered Species Act is an important tool to use to protect habitat. In this neck of the woods, of course, habitat for threatened species means old growth for spotted owls and marbled murrelets. And so maintaining those protections, that critical habitat designation is essential. Dominic talked about this a lot, but I really like this little graphic of how many pounds of carbon a large mature tree can sequester in a year. I think he said it's 10 times as much as a smaller younger forest, but just one tree can sequester up to 48 pounds of carbon every year. So there's a large tree in the proposed Devil's Staircase Wilderness. That's a good one. That's in a place. That's in a place called the Dark Grove. In part because you can tell, actually this is fun, the bark on this particular Douglas fir is blackened from a past fire. And I can tell you, being in this place, there has not been a fire in there for hundreds of years. So that tree survived a fire many, hundreds of years ago, and so it was probably hundreds of years old at the time. And so it's called the dark grove because there's a whole bunch of these big old trees that have those fire scars. But also because it's pretty darn dark in there because there's so many big old trees, so it's a great place. I do lead hikes there now and then, so you can check out Oregon Wild's website. Unfortunately, maintaining protections for these older forests is not as easy as it might seem. It seems like a no-brainer to me that why would we want to log any more of these forests we have so few of. But unfortunately, there are a lot of excuses used by the federal agencies to log these. Some of them are loopholes in the current policies and laws, and a lot of it's political pressure. We actually see a lot of legislation in Congress that basically seeks to elevate timber harvest over everything else on our public lands. So we're constantly trying to beat those things back. Okay, last leg of the stool I'll talk about here for our public lands is restoration. So, we've basically turned forests that look like this in the Coast Range and gone through a process of converting it through the process of clear cutting. This is a picture of the Siuslaw National Forest taken in 1961. Well, and we turned it into plantations that look like this. And so that's, these plantation forests are not providing the carbon storage potential in this young stage, nor the habitat that we're looking, or the water filtration properties that we really want to see from our forests. So there's an opportunity here for restoration. And that can mean some active management like thinning, which happens on the Siuslaw National Forest, and it turns the forest into looking like this. It produces some timber and it introduces some diversity. However, it's mostly done for habitat restoration. So thinking about growing the structure of an old-growth forest for like a northern spotted owl, for example. And so it's not really taking into consideration some of these carbon impacts. Dominic talked about that, thinning still removes, it still is contributing to that leaky bucket. And so those are things that, there's still improvements that can be made in considering these things in restoration. Other restoration activities that can really help with climate change on our national forests are watershed type things. So replacing culverts so that salmon can migrate up into habitat that has been revegetated along stream sides, for example, work like the Watershed Council does. And making sure that we have healthy streamside vegetation, beaver habitat, things like that will help with that, keeping the water cool and filtering out sediment. As the climate changes, that will help wildlife and adapt, and also to filter our water that's going to become a problem. So there's lots of great reasons to protect more forested wilderness, keep the protections we have in place for our older forests, and work on restoring the forests that we've already logged and streams that we've already degraded in many ways. And by doing that, we're going to help these ecosystems adapt in this time of climate change. So I've talked a bunch about water and watershed resilience, and so some of the reasons for all of this is it's all going to help with not only with taking the carbon out of the atmosphere and helping mitigate climate change in that way, but it's going to help with slowing water runoff and filtering water and keeping it colder. For plants and animals, it's going to help connect their habitats, which is really important in climate change because they are going to have to seek out new places to live if it's too warm, if their food sources aren't available, and so they need these connections. And by protecting public forest lands and restoring habitat, they're going to be able to adapt in this way. So one example is in the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument in southern Oregon. It's the only national monument in the country that's ever been designated for its biodiversity. And one of those the reasons why is because it bridges this elevation and other geographical gaps between Northern California into Oregon, going from the Coast Range into the Klamath Range and over to the Klamath Basin. So there's this whole range that's captured there, and so it's a crossroads for all sorts of species. And preserving that corridor so that they can migrate between them is really important. Another example is an effort that Oregon Wild and other groups have been working on to protect more wilderness along the crest of the Cascades, centered around Crater Lake National Park. There's already existing wilderness in the Cascades down there, but there's more potential, and that would really add a key component for animals that need to migrate from lower elevation, like down the North Umpqua, up to higher elevation. And it would be vital, especially for high elevation plants that might need to move north, because they don't have anywhere higher to go, and their habitat requires this high elevation stuff like the bristlecone pine, and that's a pika. Pikas are one of those species that are threatened by climate change. And then finally, protecting our forests, restoring them on public lands will help with this wildfire situation. Fire is a natural part of the Pacific Northwest ecology, but having native forests that are more resistant to fire, more resilient to fire, as opposed to plantations that tend to burn hotter, is important. And by doing things like prescribed burning, introducing that into management of our public lands where it's appropriate. It's not appropriate everywhere. It's probably not appropriate here, for example. We're going to be able to help our forests be more resilient. Okay, so again, Oregon Wild has distilled a lot of this information for solutions into our little booklet here, so I'll make sure that we get that. And I'm going to turn it over to Jason to talk about solution number 2. Thanks.
Make that change.